I had a strong feeling that justice was not being done.
It was devastating to see that much fear. And I'm responsible for them. I'm supposed to protect them.
We hope you enjoy Sky Country Journal. Here's Rena.
Justice. As humans, we yearn for it. It's a cornerstone of our civilization. An innocent behind bars, it's repugnant. And yet some estimate as much as 10% of the 7 million fellow Americans under correctional supervision are actually innocent. Today, I've brought you to Montana's Ivory Tower, the University of Montana, to introduce you to some community leaders who have taken action for justice.
The woods and they won't come out. And around the pond, her Aunt Sissy told her, go back and get them and tell them to come out of the woods. Dawn's friends came back about half an hour later after she went to get them, and Dawn did not. 2:30 that afternoon, Dawn Hamilton was found lying face down in a pile of leaves. Witness identification is 75% of the reason why wrongful convictions happen in the United States. 273 individuals have been exonerated behind DNA evidence, and most of them occur because of witness identification problems. Catcalls, and this place is a Gothic-looking structure with granite stones 20 feet thick, silver spires reaching up to the sky. It looks just like a castle in the middle of West Baltimore. I go walking in waist chains and block that I could barely take a shuffle with. And I could hear the catcalls come across the yard. We're going to get you, Kurt. We're going to do to you what you did to that little girl. And one night I was reading this magazine and I was laying on my rack and the power went out. And I'm not talking about just, you just get some ambient light from the street. I mean, it was pitch. You could not see your hand in front of your face. And then the bars started shaking from the tears above me. And people started screaming and hollering and setting fires and flooding the tears by shoving toilet paper and socks and stuff in their toilets and pushing the button. And this cascaded, this incredible waterfall was just swirling around my bars with every kind of lumpy thing you can think of and swooping into my cell. And these things were coming out of the ceiling because now the water's running out through the floor. And these things are hitting me in the face and in the mouth, and I'm brushing them off. And they're lighting fires. They're lighting their Bibles on fire. Their Bibles on fire. They're screaming and hollering. It's the closest thing to a literal hell that I ever felt in my life. And these things were hitting me in the mouth and in the face, and then the power popped on. And I'm not kidding, folks. There was a sea of cockroaches swimming across my ceiling. A little try. But I made a friend of a guy by the name of Blue. Blue was a 3-time loser. He'd been there 25 years. He was a strong black man from the city of Baltimore that turned to the Nation of Islam and changed his life. I mean, this man was respected amongst the community of everyone. He had these intense caramel-colored eyes that just stared at you, but he had a smile that was as bright as the sun. A nice man, a very educated man. And for one reason, I have no idea to this day that Blue took a liking to me. And he taught me how to play chess. And I don't mean in the sense that you and I would play chess in front of each other. We would move the pieces like that. We would have to play like this on one cell, and he would have the pieces, and I would have the side of the board. You would have both sides of the pieces, and then we would call them out like man, pawn, 4, and so forth. We would move them out like that. I have no idea why you won all the time. We played. And we talked about God, and we talked about philosophy, and we talked about politics. We talked about crime. And we talked about criminals. And we talked about innocence. I remember sitting there one day in the chow hall, and Blue tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, Bloodsy, because that's what everybody called me back in those days. He said, Bloodsy, he said, I'm leaving today. He had that big smile on his face, too. He was happy. I'm leaving today. And I didn't want to argue with Blue, because unlike me, he was 6'5". He says, I'm going home. He said, the court papers come. I'm getting out of here today. I'm going to go get my suit. I'm going to court. It's all over. I'm out of here. And we bumped knuckles, and I said, man, I hope I can play chess with you at Inner Harbor someday, you know. And my friend that I had met was leaving. And I went back to the law library where I worked. And Blue went back to his cell. And he put on that 3-piece suit that hung on him from not eating all the starches and all the stuff that they fed you in there. And he put on his shoes, and he put his Quran, and he put it in his box, and he put this chess set that he made out of state soap. It was quite pretty, actually. And he put his letters from his mother in there. And he tied his shoes and sat down on the edge of his bunk and took 2 number 2 pencils and shoved them right through his eyes. The one book that stuck out of my mind, because it almost had the title of my last name, except it was called The Bloody. It was written by a guy by the name Joseph Wamball, a man that was prized in his writing about police officers and crime and stuff. He was the son of a Pittsburgh police officer and an officer of his own right in L.A. He wrote books like The Onion Field and The Choir Boys, and they were made into films. But this book was a true account of the first time a new technology, dioxyribonucleic acid, this little thing on my tie, DNA. And I read in interest about this case about these 2 girls in Northborough, England, that were murdered and raped in this little town, in this little hamlet. And nobody had a clue about how to catch this guy. But this professor by the name of Alec Jeffreys, who was a professor at genetics in the University of Leicester in England, had an idea. He had developed a new technology that could identify you from him and you from her. DNA had been born in a big way. I have to tell you folks of Montana, in this college, that I had an epiphany as large as this stadium. If it can convict you, it can free you. I wrote the prosecutor a letter. I said, I want to take this new test. It's called DNA, or genetic fingerprint. I want to get all the evidence tested. Look, I agree. Anything you want to do, let's do it. Let's test it all. She wrote, we regret to inform you that the DNA evidence has been inadvertently destroyed. I was heartbroken, devastated. So Bob didn't want to get to 20 calls a day. So he went to the courthouse and went to the evidence room, and sure enough, it wasn't there. He was passing in the hallway and passed my second trial judge's court clerk in the hall. And he says, Bob, what are you doing here? And he says, well, I'm looking for the Dawn Hamilton evidence in the Kirk Bloodsworth case. He said, well, I know where that is. He said, where? He said, it's in the judge's closet in a paper bag. My mother passed away 5 months before the DNA results came back. I was sitting in my cell, and a guard stuck a Post-it note in my door. And it said, "Urgent. Call your attorney. Urgent." I run to the day room where the phones are, and I call Bob Moore a millionth time collect. And he answered the phone. And if you know Bob Moore, this is how he talks. He's really soft-spoken, really light-toned and even. And he was screaming on the other line, "Kirk, you're innocent, man! You're innocent!"
61 cases. We started the project in 1992 with the expectation of maybe getting a few people out of prison where DNA evidence could make a difference. And then we realized as the numbers started mounting that we had an additional duty, that it wasn't enough just to get people out, that we had to start examining these cases, deconstructing them, try and figure out what the heck's going wrong with the system that's allowing all these innocent people to get convicted. The biggest cause of wrongful convictions that we found in our cases was misidentification. Of the 3 cases of innocent people wrongly convicted in Montana, 2 of them involved misidentifications. The second most common cause of wrongful convictions is the misapplication of forensic science. And what I mean by misapplication could be using invalid science, using unreliable science, or using valid science, but the guy who's going into court exaggerates the probative value of the scientific evidence grossly beyond what it should be to distort the fact finder's interpretation of the evidence. For any of you who followed the stuff we did here in Montana with Arnold Melnikoff, who was the director of your crime laboratory, who was also in charge of hair microscopy, the first 3 DNA exonerations in the state all involved Melnikoff, where he gave testimony about hairs found on the rape victim matching hairs taken from the defendant. And not only did he say that they matched, but he took numbers and pulled them out of thin air, saying that the likelihood that a head hair came from anyone other than this defendant is 1 in 100, the likelihood that the pubic hair came from anyone other than the defendant is 1 in 100, and therefore the odds are 1 in 100 times 1 in 100, or 1 in 10,000, that the hairs at this crime scene could have been left by anybody but this defendant. With the sole exception of DNA, no other forensic discipline, okay, really does have the ability to identify somebody to the exclusion of everybody else. And why is it that for so long we were allowing them to do this? Because we didn't know. And how is it that these disciplines were able to take over in the courts and be utilized for 70 years and get tens of thousands of convictions when there really was no scientific basis for them? The reason is simple. DNA started not in the criminal justice system, it started in research laboratories. It then moved into medicine to identify certain diseases and do diagnostic work, long before it ever hit the criminal justice system. Consequently, there was a body of basic research, applied research, tens of thousands of peer-reviewed articles, FDA approval of the kits to use for disease diagnostics, long before it ever got to criminal justice. But these other disciplines never went through the scientific method. There's no medical application for fingerprints, for bite marks, okay, for hair and fiber analysis. And they were developed by law enforcement for law enforcement. What we're trying to do about it is to, for the first time, to get a national agency in place that will create national standards, that will fund basic and applied research, much the same way we had a revolution in clinical medicine 100 years ago. We want to try and replicate that for forensic medicine and forensic science now. The second thing we're trying to do, which is part of that report, is to conduct audits. You know, when we have a problem, I'm on the board of a medical school and a hospital back in New York. When we have an unexpected bad result in the OR, not only do we do a root cause analysis to find out what went wrong, but we also go back and look at other surgical procedures conducted by that same physician to see whether this was a one-off situation or whether it was indicative of a systemic problem. And we do that in all kinds of things. You do that if an engine fails. You do that when there's a train wreck. We do that when you catch somebody embezzling money who's a bank teller. You don't just go, oh, he embezzled money. No, you might conduct an audit to see if he did it with other transactions. So the notion of a retrospective audit is something we're all familiar with in our important institutions. But for instance, here in Montana, when we caught Melnikoff fabricating evidence in three serious cases in a row, like that. They were all exonerated by DNA. We pressed the then Attorney General Mike McGrath to conduct an audit here, and he refused. And he got away with it. He wasn't forced by the people of Montana to do it, so we didn't do it. And it's unconscionable. Third problem, false confessions. I was a criminal defense lawyer, and I couldn't believe that anybody would ever confess to a crime he didn't commit unless he had a gun to his head. And I was wrong. 25% of our wrongful convictions cleared by DNA involve false confessions. A guy named Earl Washington came within 6 days of execution in Virginia, confessed to a high-profile, cross-racial rape murder of a young white housewife. And not only did he confess, but he actually, in that confession, said, "And I left my shirt in the top dresser drawer in the victim's bedroom because it had blood on it. I didn't want to walk outside." And they recovered a shirt from there. And so that became very powerful evidence that that confession was reliable. Okay, the problem was that that statement about the shirt wasn't coming from Earl Washington originally. It was something that was given to him during the interrogation by the police. Another problem, and a lot of folks don't like to discuss this, is the problem of police and prosecutorial misconduct. Almost 50% of our cases involve one or the other. There has to be accountability for people who break the rules, even if they're not committing crimes, okay? And there isn't any for prosecutors in this country. There is no effective disciplinary program anywhere in America. There is no, we did a study on all the cases that had been reversed for prosecutorial misconduct in California. There were several hundred that came up over a 10-year period, and only one person was disciplined out of several hundred prosecutors where there were explicit findings of prosecutorial misconduct. It doesn't happen. The same thing with defense attorneys who are bad lawyers and engage in bad lawyering. There's no accountability. As you saw in the Roy Brown case, we had an informant who was a jailhouse snitch. We've had jailhouse snitches in 15% of these cases. Guys who are going to get deals. In this case, this was a guy who got picked up for possession of a gun. And after he came forward with this information about Roy Brown, they dismissed the gun charge. The jury didn't even know about it. Sometimes the jury does know about it, but they still want to believe the guy. And why do they believe him? Because a horrible crime was committed and the community needs closure. That what we're trying to do here, as was mentioned in the introduction, is actually create a whole new civil rights movement in criminal justice. And the Montana Innocence Project is part of that. We're now a national movement, a network of in more than 35 states, of law students, of journalism students, of public offenders, of undergraduate students in some places like downstate Illinois, where the kids are going out and breaking open a few cases and solving them. It's really quite something. It's quite impressive. You think about it more for lawyers and law students, but it's great that there are journalism students doing it here. Montana is one of the few places where the journalism students are an essential part of that program. For those of you who have lived through the last 10 years and see not just the erosion of important newspapers in this country, but also the elimination of investigative journalism.
My interest began, I guess, by reading the Missoula Independent newspaper, and Jesse McQuillan was writing a series of articles about the Berry Beach case. And I became fascinated about that case and wanted to know more about it. And so I went to the parole hearings in Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge, where Berry was presenting his case again. And it was a 3-day hearing, and it was very interesting and very, very sad, I thought. And I had a strong feeling that justice was not being done.
We're founded by a group of community leaders headed by then Senator Dan Weinberg in the middle of 2008. So since that time, we've reviewed over 300 claims of innocence from all over the state, people who are convicted both in state and federal court and are claiming to be actually innocent of the crimes that they are convicted of. So we review their cases, and when we identify people who have credible claims of innocence and there's some type of independent evidence, whether it's DNA or other evidence to corroborate their claim, then we work to help them in the courts and to exonerate them. We work with law, journalism, paralegal, and criminology students, and we assign them to cases kind of depending on the needs of a specific case, and also then the you know, the skills and talents of the students we're working with. And so we also involve 2 members of our board of directors, Dennis Swybold and Clem Work, who are both professors at the UM School of Journalism. So, you know, the student journalists, as well as the other students, but really get a kind of hands-on training and on-the-ground experience that's difficult to get in most academic settings. So, you know, we closely supervise them and you know, oversee their work, but they are really, you know, given an opportunity to dig into something that has a real impact and a real meaning for this state. You know, we look at it as helping to train the next generation of Montana's lawyers and journalists and paralegals too. And so, you know, we've educated, I guess in the last 3 years, about 30 people have gone through our clinic, and so they've all, you know, learned how to kind of raise their antenna to these issues, and then also what people can do to look into or to help somebody who's been wrongly convicted. And at the 2009 legislative session, we helped to pass a law requiring that all felony interrogations around the state are recorded. And that's a simple reform. So we worked, that was one of our first policy issues, and then we've also been working to improve the preservation of DNA evidence that's collected from crime scenes. The current law in Montana has been to preserve this evidence for only 3 years following a final conviction, and we know both from Montana's experience and around the country that is just far too short. Jimmy Bromgard served almost 15 years in prison before he could get the DNA tested in his case, and it was really only, you know, it was found preserved in the basement of the courthouse, but really just through an accident, not owing to any official policy. And yes, Barry Beach was just granted a new trial just before Thanksgiving, and then was released on bond pending this new trial. He was just released after almost 29 years in prison, so it's, you know, his case and his release last week are both remarkable. He's not a client of the Montana Innocence Project. Centurion Ministries, which is a national innocence organization, has worked on his case for over the last 12 years before we existed here at the Montana Innocence Project. But we have assisted with some parts of the investigation, and so we're really happy to see him walk free. And you know, in my work as a reporter, before I helped start the Innocence Project, I investigated Barry Beach's case very thoroughly and did a lot of reporting about it. So yeah, after 6 years of working on his case, it's been remarkable to watch him walk free.